And we're back. Hi, everybody, and welcome to this week's lecture. This week, we'll be talking about two domains of wellness. There's a great deal of overlap between these, so it's fitting that we spend time talking about them together. First, we're going to talk about Chapter 9, which refers to preventative self-care. It's a concept that's core to a prevention orientation that we have in wellness and in this class. Now, one portion of preventing illness is exercise, so after we talk about Chapter 9, we'll move to talk about Chapter 7 and talk about physical activity. Exercise is probably the domain that everyone is most familiar with. It's probably the one we hear most about. I mean, we're constantly hearing that we should be exercising, but usually the information we get is somewhat shallow, and we don't really get a lot of the details that we need to understand how important it is or what we need to do to really implement some kind of lasting change. So this week we'll spend time talking about some of the finer details of physical activity. And as always, these lectures are going to build on the textbook material. So although there might be some overlap between the lecture and the textbook, we're going to be branching into some new areas. And to do your best on the quizzes, be sure to study both the lecture and the textbook. All right, let's get started. All right, so here's a more detailed overview of today's lecture to give you a better idea of how we're going to go about approaching these topics. We're going to introduce some new information about preventative self-care in order to acquaint students with the topic. When introducing the topic, it wouldn't make sense to discuss prevention if we didn't take the time to discuss all of the different resources students have available to them at OSU, specifically on the main campus here in Columbus. So we'll highlight some of the more popular options that students have at their disposal. Now, with regards to physical activity, we want to connect exercise to more than just physical benefits. We'll share statistics and the relationship between exercise and your psychological well-being. Also, we'll talk about some of the guidelines that I believe in with regards to exercise. My personal perspective comes from a lifetime as a former student athlete. I also coached some college track, as well as becoming a wellness counselor in the state of Ohio, and a researcher who really loves reading the different studies on exercise. So I think that sometimes we get a pretty one-dimensional perspective of exercise as some high-intensity activity that's painful and difficult to start doing. And so I really want to bust some of those myths and talk about what types of exercise really benefits health. So as I mentioned, let's start with Chapter 9 and talk more about preventative self-care. So nearly half of the deaths each year in the United States are due to preventable causes. More than half the diseases that we deal with are attributed to these preventable behaviors. We might actually spend years of our lives managing a chronic condition that can be traced back to certain preventable actions. What we're talking about with preventative self-care is being proactive with your health. So remember the continuum for wellness? I put it here on the right hand of the slide. And picture this man here stuck in a rut. Our health is usually only a priority to us when we're ill and we're in that rut or on a path towards negative well-being. So when we're on the red end of that spectrum, we focus on returning to a healthy, neutral point. This could be seeing a doctor for medicine that gets rid of our symptoms. It could be doing all sorts of different things. But once we get back to that neutral point or the middle of that continuum, we stop. Now, if we stop here, we're simply just waiting to get sick again. Hopefully by now you're starting to understand that being well doesn't demand a certain chunk of time out of your day, but awareness, and that all things you do can be done well. And we don't say that as in done without flaw or done perfectly. We mean they could be done with a sense of well-being or mindfulness. And preventative self-care is being intentional about those steps to work towards high level wellness on the continuum here, and not just staying at your neutral point. That way, when the unfortunate happens and illness crosses your paths, you won't be dragged immediately into the red, but you might be brought closer towards that neutral greenish area. Can you think of a time that when you got some sort of illness, but you felt pretty resilient through it, and it didn't really affect you as bad as it had in the past? Maybe you managed that illness better than usual? Well, it doesn't have to randomly happen. We can be intentional in making that happen by focusing on preventative care. Because when we're higher up on our continuum, we're more resilient. And that's something we've talked about before. And when we're more resilient, we manage illness better than we might have if we were just simply at a neutral point or even already in a rut. So I like to think of preventative self care as growing a tree. Many of us are in a habit where we expect fruits, but few of us want to take the time that goes into planting and nurturing the tree that's going to give us that fruit. So think of a marathon runner. Many people might wake up and decide that they're interested in running a marathon, but who wants to spend that much time training? Certain training plans expect people to devote around 6 months or so to training. And then that 6 months is going to consist of daily running and daily stretching that's supposed to prepare your body for the marathon. The idea that we have to make such a commitment to a training program might turn us off, and others might start the program and realize this isn't really what they expected and end up changing their goal. The same is for your preventative care. We have to make a commitment that every so often we're going to stop and see our doctor or do something well. That can include having your cholesterol tested, it can include flossing or brushing your teeth, it could be an STD check, it could be wearing a helmet while you ride your bike, it could be some kind of preventative care that reduces your risk. The results of those tests or those behaviors can point us towards different things to change. To use a personal example, I spent the past 2 years or so having my blood sugar and cholesterol tested. Now I'm not in a dangerous zone or anything, but I decided that I wanted to start working and adjusting my diet so everything becomes more manageable and appropriate now in my 20s rather than waiting till later in life. Frankly, I'd rather figure out what kind of diet I need to be on while I'm now in my mid 20s than waiting until later when those habits are much more solidified and it'd be much harder for me to change my lifestyle. So let's talk about uh, what these preventive matters can look like. But while we do, keep in mind that what kinds of commitments you're interested in, maybe we can plant some seeds for future well being today. So here are some of the popular recommendations with regards to prevention. One of the easiest, that probably doesn't surprise many of us, is losing weight. A lower BMI is correlated with many health benefits. It isn't just the fact that you have less weight on your joints, but the benefits that come from the activities you do to lose the weight. For instance, if you exercise, we would expect you to lose excess weight, but that activity also leads you to develop better cardiovascular health. It would also improve your mental and psychological functioning, and you would probably feel better throughout the day and sleep better at night. It's the same kind of logic for a healthy diet. Not only would a healthy diet lead you to lose excessive body weight, but you'll also be improving your nutrition, giving your body vitamins and minerals that it uses to function properly. And when you do that, you'll undoubtedly feel better. So when you hear losing excess weight, keep in mind that it's not just losing the weight for the sake of being smaller. It's emphasizing that all the different behaviors that lead to weight loss and all of those benefits as well. Now we'll talk more about exercise in a few minutes, so let's talk about some of these other popular forms of preventative self-care. The next most common is having a regular checkup. You can see your doctor who can check your blood pressure, cholesterol, and blood sugar. Do you remember a blood pressure cuff at the store? Those machines that sat by the pharmacy? Maybe as a kid you would sit and put your arm into the hole and let the computer squeeze your arm, giving you a readout of your results. As a kid it was fun, but now it's important to notice that those machines are there for the adults as an early form of detection. Some students might even recognize some of these smaller blood pressure tests that people will have in their homes, usually when they're prescribed by a doctor. You might have also noticed those little blood pressure stands near the pharmacy and the store are starting to include more tests, and some will ask you questions about your diet and your weight, and others might even include options for a quick vision test, etc. So whether you're going to the doctor, sitting at one of these kiosks, or playing at home with a home blood pressure test, these are all forms of prevention. Your doctor can tell you that your cholesterol looks what it looks like today, so you can start making positive changes long before you experience a chronic illness, such as diabetes or stroke, that might devastate your sense of immediate health and forces you onto a path of change. The book has a great list of these screenings, so I definitely recommend everyone takes a moment to look those over. One of the other common or popular things people hear about is their BMI score. BMI stands for Body Mass Index and is frequently used in health. If you've had a doctor's appointment recently, you might have noticed that your appointment starts with you taking off your shoes and stepping onto the scale. Keeping track of your weight is one of the easiest indicators of health, and many, if not all, doctors' offices will include this index in your file. Now, the BMI research isn't perfect. After all, a study has found that the majority of professional football players had poor BMI scores. I played football in college, and I can tell you my BMI probably didn't match my level of fitness. But even though the correlation between the BMI and the health isn't perfect, it's undeniable and is a great way for nearly all Americans to measure their health. Myself included have taken the challenge to reduce my BMI score since my college days have ended. It's calculated using a ratio between your height and your weight, and the healthy age ranges are going to be listed here. And there's also a link here on the slide to the National Heart and Lung and Blood Institute, and they have their own calculator online if you'd like to type that link into your browser. I've got a chart here on the next slide, so feel free to pause and copy that link, or we can move on and take a look at this chart. So this is what a typical BMI chart will probably look like. There might be some differences between this chart and others, but it's essentially what you can expect. If you look at the top of the chart in gray, there are different weights listed from left to right. On the far left-hand side in gray, there's a list of heights ranging from about 5 feet at the top all the way down to about 6'4". If you find your height and weight, you can trace those lines together to see what your approximate BMI score is. Now the chart is also color-coded, with the green zone being ideal for most Americans. The ranges outside of the green are cause for varying levels of concern. Think about which zone your weight falls into. How would you or your weight have to change if you were going to move closer to the green zone? I think a good goal would be trying to move yourself at least one block or column closer to that ideal zone, or to work to get to the next zone over. For instance, if you're in the orange, maybe working to get to the yellow. Those in the dark red might be interested in moving towards the medium orange, etc. It might seem like an unrealistic expectation, but if you made a change today, in a few months or a year, you might see yourself transition much more than you anticipated into a zone that had far less risk for disease or poor health. And it's important to understand that even though the research is flawed, healthcare providers and insurance companies put a lot of weight or stock into your BMI. So here's a list of some of the benefits that can come from actually lowering your BMI. The risk for the first list of diseases is largely decided based upon our decisions. We commonly hear about how our genes play a role in our risk, and that is certainly true, but too often people use this argument as a reason not to make an effort or a change. The results vary a little bit, but studies have found that anywhere from 50 to 60% of our risk comes from our lifestyle behaviors. So on a bad day, our genetics and other factors that are out of our control only account for about half of our risk. At least half is based on the decisions you make today and the ones you're going to make tomorrow. So the way we live can directly influence some of these outcomes. However, our lifestyle doesn't necessarily eliminate any risk. That's where screenings come in. Having a regularly scheduled checkup and screenings aren't always fun, but they can help us detect issues early on, long before they become bigger, nastier problems. That means that treatment could be less difficult and recovery could be much easier. On the slide here is a list of cancers that can be caught early by screenings. Catching these cancers early dramatically improves outcomes. Unfortunately, cancer is a very threatening and scary word in our culture, but we can take little steps to make it less threatening by being proactive and using the help of different doctors and physicians and procedures, etc. And that's why learning and implementing these habits now is such a good idea for college students. Many of the students in this class are in their late teens and early 20s, but we have many who have moved on a little further in their lives. Regardless of age, now's the time to start being proactive. You can figure out what type of diet and exercise puts you in these healthy ranges of cholesterol, blood sugar, BMI, etc. before your lifestyle habits become even more difficult to change. It always reminds me of a saying, like the photo on the right of the slide here when it says, the best time to plant a tree was 20 years ago, but the second best time is right now. Many people in their years tell us that making changes now will save them hardships later. And even though our students are often young, this is when many of those bad habits start to develop. It's often a student's first time living on their own. They have less parental supervision. It's also a time where you're going to be pushed as a person and as a student. So the lack of guidance and the increase in stress might lead many of us to develop pretty negative habits in order to cope, like eating junk food that tastes good when we're stressed out, or watching TV to relax, etc. To top it all off, there's a present bias among young adults. Many of us in this class, both of those in this class as well as the traditional student body in general, would admit that they know what healthy behaviors are and that they aren't that worried about long-term consequences now because they're young. Part of that's true because with youth comes resiliency, but it's also not a blank check for making bad health behaviors. So the main point to take away is that stress can be at the root of many of the bad behaviors we engage in. Bad food choices, not exercising, watching large amounts of TV, or spending excessive time on the internet can be traced back to being overly stressed. Typically, those behaviors make us feel at least a little bit better, or they simply distract us from the stress altogether. Now, given that stress can make us act in unhealthy ways, and those behaviors lead towards disease, stress can hurt us both in the short and long term. There are choices that we make to cope with that stress that could also be pro-health. For instance, exercising to blow off steam instead of eating a whole bag of chips or candy. As we'll talk about shortly, that exercise wouldn't only benefit you mentally, but also physically in many of the different other domains of wellness. Choosing to be pro-health and coping in ways that benefit you can help you reduce the impact of those stressors or to remove the negative effects once they occur, all of which is going to improve your stress and prevents negative health outcomes. So here's what we have available on our main campus at Ohio State. I can't possibly list all the different resources, but here's what I consider to be our big three. First, the RPAC at OSU has many facilities that we can take advantage of as students. You can go to recsports.osu.edu to see a schedule for all the different facilities, but also a list, and I guess another schedule, of all the free classes that OSU has available as well. Next, consider looking up some of the services you're entitled to as a student through Student Health Services. Their website, listed here on the slide, can show you some of the different tests, appointments, vaccines, etc. that you can sign yourself up for. Depending on your insurance, there might be some sort of small fee associated with certain tests, but not all of them. We talked about cholesterol and blood sugar earlier, and those tests are usually about $20 each. You can find information on those by going to shs.osu.edu and looking under the Order It Yourself Testing tab. Now, rounding out our trio of recommendations is the Student Wellness Center. You can go to their website and find resources matching all of those different domains of wellness, as well as a sign up to speak with a wellness counselor. It might be particularly interesting to sit down with somebody who studies these areas and talk about what wellness might look like for you individually. My only challenge to you would be to pick one aspect of preventative self-care and to give it a shot. So no matter what you choose, I hope you recognize that the benefits can help you, and maybe it'll lead to something more in the future. Alright, so let's summarize what we've talked about so far. When focusing on preventative self-care, we're talking about habits from flossing, wearing a helmet, seeing a doctor, having a screening done, etc. Anything that's going to prevent a potential issue or lower your risk. We made a case for why we can start thinking about these things sooner than later, mostly just focusing on replacing poor coping behaviors with more positive ones. And we've talked about the many different resources we have here on our Columbus campus. Way too many to list, but I gave you my top three. And so in general, I just want to give you the information you need and challenge you to make one pro-health decision today that might be preventative in nature. And when you do that, we can see where it leads you. And maybe it leads to other changes and maybe it doesn't, but hopefully it's something done for the better. But with that being said, let's shift gears to talk more about physical activity. It's certainly a form of preventative self-care, but it's definitely much more. Almost all of us have probably heard at some point in our lives that we should be exercising, but rarely does someone try to break down what exercise should look like. So let's dive into some of those finer details and talk about them today. Let's start with a few definitions. Physical activity is considered any bodily movement that involves your muscles, where exercise is just one type of physical activity. Exercise is planned and repetitive behavior done for some purpose. This can include what we typically think of as exercise, like jogging or running, but it can also include things that we do in our daily lives, such as exercise we might get at work, etc. So I think it's important to keep these distinctions clear because sometimes we overfocus exercise only on a handful of activities, and sometimes we think any physical activity is considered exercise, but that's not necessarily the case. Now, next, we want to talk about psychological well-being and how it refers to our own perception of our life. Positive psychological well-being is only one indicator of positive mental functioning. Again, sometimes we can make a mistake of thinking that psychological well-being means more than it really does. Someone might have a strong sense of psychological well-being and still have issues to address in their mental functioning, like some of those irrational beliefs or so forth that we talked about before. When we talk about psychological well-being, think of someone who is more positive than negative, making them more resilient and better able to handle stress and adversity. So it's not hard to picture exercise as something that can be, at times, hard or inconvenient. And so it's easy to see why having a sense of psychological well-being or resilience would be necessary in order to, partake in exercise. But it is important to know that when we exercise, we're actually improving our psychological well-being. It's a reciprocal relationship there that kind of cycles in a positive direction. So let's talk more about the psychological aspects of exercise and the relationship between the two. So let's take a moment to think about the fact that we have 40 million adults in the United States who have clinical elevations of anxiety and depression. And when I say clinical elevations, I mean that their symptoms are severe enough that they interfere with their daily lives. That's what it means to be clinically elevated. Both anxiety and depression are the most common mental health concerns among Americans, and they're both directly tied, at least in some part, to stress. Interestingly, they're both also tied to physical activity. Now, we've talked before about how exercise can help us reduce stress, and that also means that being an active person will help lower your risk for developing anxious or depressive symptoms. There's also good news for those who have already started experiencing some of these symptoms, where physical activity can reduce the severity of those symptoms and make them much more manageable. But I do want to make it clear that if you're experiencing clinical levels of symptomology, you should definitely talk with a counselor by contacting the counseling and consultation services at ccs.osu.edu. Now back to this here. When we're talking about physical activity and how it manages these symptoms, the exercise is actually going to relate to the blood flow and chemicals that are released in your brain when you exercise. So you can burn off that anxiety or relieve that depression, as well as boost positive feelings, all while being active. Now, what's interesting is, even with all of the benefits, it's relatively rare to find people who meet the guidelines for exercise. Take a look at the table here. It compares the rates of exercise among groups between 2008 and 2013. It's data taken directly from the Healthy People Initiative 2020, the third round of initiatives that the federal government started that we mentioned earlier in one of the previous lectures. You can see that the rates of people engaging in no exercise is dropping, while people meeting the minimum recommendations is increasing, which is good news, right? But ironically, it's not what's happening amongst teenagers, including some of the younger students in this class. Surprisingly, rates of teenagers meeting those guidelines for exercise has dropped from about 29% in 2011 to 27% in 2013 in just 2 years. Now, there could be any number of reasons for this, but tying these points from earlier in this lecture and other talks, think about finding different ways to be more active is very important, even for those who might be younger and more healthy or resilient. Here's a longer list of some of the activities that exercise can impact. We might not be surprised to see a few of these here, but there also might be a few that do catch us off guard. Earlier, we talked about how lowering your weight is an excellent way to prevent many issues, but we made it clear that it wasn't just the fact that you would weigh less. It's due to all the indirect effects of losing weight, such as having a more positive diet. Well, the same goes for exercise. There might be many direct benefits from becoming more active, but there are easily as many, if not more, indirect benefits. For instance, when we were at practice in college, we would see a lot of the middle aged and older adults walking around the track at practice, and several of them said they wanted to stay healthy and keep the moving parts moving. Healthy activity leads to healthier joints and muscles, which then lowers risks for arthritis. The blood flow and chemical changes we mentioned earlier can also boost your cognitive functioning. For instance, have you ever been exercising or walking somewhere or doing something and suddenly had a good idea? It might have been a result of the increased blood flow or the chemical changes in your brain. So, if you take all of these into consideration, the call to exercise isn't just a demand to lose weight and sweat, but towards a more comprehensive call to improve your daily life. So, like we mentioned a couple slides ago, regardless of the benefits, exercise is something we just don't do. I've cited a study before that found that at least half of those who start a new exercise regimen give it up within the first 6 months. And nearly three-quarters of those with gym memberships give up going to the gym soon after they start. But why? From my experience and what I've read, I would argue that many people set poor goals and often burn themselves out on overexertion or unrealistic outcome expectations. Remember from our goal setting lecture, if we cannot satisfy our outcome expectations, we give up the behavior. Now, I'm going to say that the problem wasn't with the behavior, the problem was with the expectations. Think of it this way: if you haven't had a regular exercise regimen before, how would you really know what the outcomes are? And how would you expect certain things if you weren't familiar with it? You might start expecting an outcome A and get outcome B, leading you to be disappointed. One of the attitudes I share with others now is that we know exercise is good for us, but all of us will experience some kind of different benefit. So instead of having outcome expectations, I encourage my clients to engage in the behavior and then keep their eyes or ears open for the benefits. Some might say they benefited cognitively from exercise, where some might have more energy, and someone else might just be happy with the weight loss, etc. But if we all had the same outcome expectation, each of those individuals might be disappointed with what they actually gained. So no matter what we do, we're looking to improve the rate at which folks stick with it. Consider the terms here on the slide. If you have a doctor give you a recommendation, say a walking regimen, or maybe you have to take a medication each day, if you follow those short-term recommendations, officially you're compliant. If we stretch this into something more than just a short-term list of instructions, say taking a class at the RPAC this semester, and you attend many, if not a majority of those classes, we would say that you adhered to your goal or to your exercise regimen. Then lastly, over time, someone can start maintaining that behavior. If you stick with something long enough, let's say beyond the end of the semester, and you've moved more into a maintenance phase, remember the trans-theoretical model we talked about, the different stages of change? That maintenance phase is the one associated with behaviors that have changed into becoming habits. And that's how we would refer to the different types of sticking with it when we talk about your goals or maybe a doctor's recommendation, etc. So let's talk a little bit more about what types of exercise are actually beneficial for us. So let's talk about the connection between physical activity and your attitude. Keep in mind that we're going to be talking about moderate exercise here, not light or vigorous. We'll talk more about what the definitions of these are, but for now just understand that moderate exercise is neither too light nor too difficult. Now, we talked earlier about how exercise can boost how you feel psychologically by both addressing feelings of anxiety and depression before and after they've occurred. You start feeling those benefits mentally before you start experiencing that physical growth. For instance, if you're a jogger, you'll benefit psychologically from the jogging before you feel yourself getting faster or the jogging getting easier physically. So when we talk about exercising for health, there are no expectations that you need to become bigger, faster, or stronger. Simply partaking in an activity will help you with those benefits. Now, with regards to those benefits, you more or less stop experiencing the benefits of the activity as soon as you stop engaging in them. A common misconception is believing that those benefits will last more than a few days after you've stopped exercising. So now, for the second main point, the better your attitude is when you exercise, the easier it is to stick to it. This ties back into exercising being moderate instead of vigorous. Exercise that is too strenuous is far too difficult to regularly enjoy, so finding ways to enjoy your activity will help you stick with your regimen. Not only will you feel better about getting out and being active, but the ongoing positive feelings will boost your self-efficacy. After all, you've been pretty successful with the behavior, right? If you're feeling good about it, that'll give you more confidence and more positive self-concept and self-esteem to get out there and do it again. It's when we try to do too much or have irrational beliefs about what we think we need to do, or think that exercise will be agonizing, that we're going to be far less likely to participate, which in turn damages all of these beliefs we have about ourselves. So I recommend always starting a little bit lighter than you think you need to, just to be safe. And after a few experiences with this exercise, you'll really understand what you're comfortable with, and it'll give your body, including your muscles, your joints, etc., time to adjust to that exercise before you start increasing the intensity. So having a positive attitude going into the exercise makes it easier for us to participate, and that participation gives us benefits. The same concept applies after exercise. If you participate in some kind of moderate activity and afterwards you have positive feelings about the experience, for instance, you're glad that you did it, you'll be much more likely to go back for more. This may be particularly important for people who are just getting started. Initially, we might still not be very happy to go out and exercise. Maybe it's a little uncomfortable, maybe we don't like being sweaty, etc. So having a positive attitude during can be a challenge. But afterwards, you can tell yourself that you enjoyed the experience and find at least one reason to explain why you enjoyed it. That will make picking up an exercise regimen much easier. My second point ties back to a previous topic we talked about. Can you remember a time when you opened a mystery bag or a box? Maybe it was a Christmas gift, maybe something for your birthday, could have been a card, maybe it was a pack of cards that you would get at the store when you were younger. Either way, try to think of a time when you opened a package and you weren't sure what the contents were inside. We get excited to open it up and see what's in there, and usually we're satisfied with the contents, right? Can you also think of a time when you had really high expectations for one of these packages? You might have opened it and felt a little disappointed when you realized that the contents didn't quite match up to what your imagination had cooked up for you. That's what we're talking about with unrealistic outcome expectations. Sometimes individuals have set unrealistically high expectations for these exercises. Sometimes they're very realistic, but they require more time than we anticipated. For instance, how long it takes you to train for a marathon. That's how the extreme diet pills make their money. They promise huge results and lots of weight loss, and they promise to get it to you fast. I recommend taking away some of those outcome expectations and simply exercising because you know it's right. And if you have that faith that exercise will lead you somewhere positive, you'll eventually find what your personal benefits are. Like opening your own mystery bag of physical rewards, exercise can lead you to any kind of mental, physical, emotional benefits. And all these benefits could be those that you didn't necessarily expect before you started. Now, the final point for this article is that these benefits aren't really linked to the more intense exercises. It's important to note that a small portion of us are still highly competitive athletes, and those athletes are the ones that benefit from having those more intense regimens. You also have to keep in mind that these athletes have regimens that are carefully designed as to not to overdo it, with scheduled times of easy training and rest, as well as some peaks there where the exercise is more intense. So these people are likely to also have athletic trainers and staff that help with ice massages for the muscles and other types of recovery practices to help them bounce back from this intense exercise. So it's not fair to treat ourselves like these athletes. And we can bust this myth that we have to go to extremes in order to really benefit from exercise. Here are a couple of the theories as to how these activities benefit us. Now, the book covers these really well, so we'll be really brief when we mention them here. The mastery hypothesis is first. This states that people have positive feelings as a result of exercise and seeing some of the different outcomes from the behavior. So think of a time where you spent a lot of effort or energy working on something, and when you finished, you stepped back and felt really proud of what you did. This includes both the short term, when we are satisfied with the immediate exercise, but also the effects that we notice in more the long term. When we see our abilities improve, other benefits start adding up as well. We feel increasingly better about the activity. These proud feelings lead us to more positive feelings in other areas of life, etc. Now, the second theory is the distraction hypothesis. This is analogous to those times when we're simply too stressed out and just want to get away from things. There are many who benefit from exercise because it's their getaway. It gives them a chance to escape from all of life's different stressors. Now, we can take a few minutes to exercise, which demands our attention. We have to focus on what we're doing in the activity before we have to go back to the real world. It's a distraction that gives us some of the relief from that different stress and tension, and that's how we benefit from the activity. Now, lastly is the enjoyment or social interaction hypothesis. This might be most clearly seen in individuals who are interested in exercising with friends, maybe by taking a class or competing in different kinds of games, like basketball, having races, other intramural sports, etc. Whether it's rollerblading or sand volleyball, this mixes physical activity with social aspects or other portions of mental engagement. The hypothesis states that there's something in each of these different forms of activity that we engage in that we enjoy, and it's that enjoyment that leads us to positive feelings in other areas. I hope that you can find yourself identifying with at least one of these. They're not perfect, and not everybody fits everywhere very neatly, and maybe you apply or can find things you identify with in multiple different hypotheses. But take some time to think of specific examples and think through the reasoning. It might be a little tricky at first because you haven't done it before, but taking the time to learn how to think through this process can lead you to longer lasting benefits in the future. Now, there are also more biological theories claiming to understand why we enjoy exercise. Let's take a moment to briefly go over these. Again, they're in the textbook, so we're just going to touch on them here, and if you want a more in-depth review, I would refer you to the chapter. The first is the monoamine hypothesis, and it claims that changes in the chemicals in the brain cause improvements in your mood. It's really similar to the effects of many medications. In fact, the book and some of the things we've discussed in other lectures ties those connections here and makes an argument that the effects of exercise are analogous to those of medication. The textbook also goes into other detail about similarities between exercise and psychotherapy, so feel free to review that there. The second is the endorphin hypothesis. This is the most popular and probably the most referred to. You might also think of this when you hear about people talking about like a runner's high, but this claims that exercise causes the brain to release endorphins that boosts your performance and also your mood and other aspects of functioning. So it's important to understand that there's evidence for both of these hypotheses that we've talked about, both on this slide and the one before it. The most likely conclusion, like I mentioned before, is that there's some kind of combination between all of these different things that takes place for each individual. That's why it's important to be mindful and aware of how you benefit from being physically active, and that way you can be more intentional with it in the future. So let's get into some of the more concrete details and recommendations that individuals should try to adhere to if they'd like to become more active or receive the most benefits. We've already talked about how the different effects of exercise can kind of wear off within a couple of days if you stop. So let's talk about how long our exercise sessions need to be. The accepted rule of thumb in the medical community is at least 30 minutes of moderate exercise 5 days a week, which gives you a total of 150 minutes per week. What's nice about this is that the research suggests that we can break these down into more manageable chunks of about 10 minutes each, which would be 3 different 10-minute sessions in one day. This might be especially nice for individuals who have fairly sedentary jobs. I, for instance, like to take a break every once in a while to walk up and down stairs. It helps me kind of work through writer's block. It gets me like unstuck with different things and gets me back to work refreshed and focused. You can also break this down by vigorous exercise, which would be about 15 minutes a day for 5 days a week, or 75 minutes a week. Now, with regards to the type of exercise, there's research supporting both cardio and resistance or strength training. Much of the medical field would recommend sticking mostly to cardio and keeping your heart rate elevated while mixing in some strength or resistance exercises about twice a week. And now let's finally define what moderate exercise is. We've talked about it a lot, so let's get a really concrete idea. A good rule of thumb is to use the talk principle. For instance, if during exercise it is relatively easy to talk, then you're probably experiencing light exercise. Once you begin exercising to the point where talking becomes a little more difficult and it takes a little extra effort, that's when you're starting to reach the moderate region of exercise. And it's when exercising is hard and your breathing is too difficult in order to talk or speak that you're crossing into vigorous exercise. You can also keep an eye on your heart rate. That's easy to do with a lot of the different exercise equipment like treadmills that have the sensors, but you can also take your own by finding your pulse either on your wrist or your neck or maybe somewhere else and counting the beats for 15 seconds. If you count how many beats occur in 15 seconds, you can multiply that by 4 and get your total beats per minute. A moderate BPM is somewhere around 60% of your max heart rate. But what is your max heart rate, you might ask? Let's find out on the next slide. Here's a table that breaks down your max heart rate by age. Keep in mind that it might be dangerous for those who are new to exercise to really push their heart rate. So instead, I would really try to focus on light to moderate exercise until you acclimate and find what's comfortable for you. You definitely need to speak with a doctor if you have any concerns or if this is something new to you, and they will be able to give you much more concrete recommendations. Feel free to pause the lecture here if you'd like and take a look at the age and the associated max heart rate. We also include the percentages here, so if you find your max heart rate, you can multiply it by 0.6 to see what moderate ranges might be for you, as well as 0.9 to get the more vigorous and aggressive. Alright, so let's use one of our last slides here to talk about the myths associated with physical activity. First, there's a common myth when we hear people say, if there's no pain, there's no gain. In my experience, this is far more associated with people who are performance-oriented or competitive athletes. You certainly don't have to experience discomfort when you're exercising to improve your well-being. In fact, discomfort could be a sign that something's going wrong and you should try to address it by seeking care from a healthcare professional. The next is the give it all you got myth. And that means that we have to max out or give 110% to get results. It's another false idea that many of us are led to believe. In my work, I would much rather see people give me 60% of their max 5 days a week than someone who pushes themselves extremely hard but ends up overloading themselves. Even when I was coaching athletes back at Heidelberg University, I really stressed for people to give me about 95% each day, which confuses a lot of athletes. But if you can give me 95% each day for 6 days, I could get a lot more out of you than if you gave me 110% 2, maybe 3 days a week. So remember that you can't just push yourself to the max indefinitely. What goes up definitely has to come back down. So find a more moderate approach that you can maintain over the long term. Now, if you do feel a pressure to push yourself to your limits, speaking to some of those more competitive students out there, first, definitely be safe. I definitely wouldn't overexert yourself early on if you're new to a certain exercise. Figure out where you are and build from there. If you really want to be that competitive, you need to be patient and work with individuals to get some of those more performance-oriented goals. Also, keep in mind that the more exertion you put on the body has to be matched with more rest and recovery. So consider your training cycles and giving yourself more rest. You can schedule in periods of lighter, more recovery-based exercise, or you can be intentional about making sure you get the ice, the massage, the other things you need for your body to bounce back. Because it's simply not realistic to demand all of this from your body without returning some of it through proper rest, recovery, and nutrition. If you choose to do that, you'll be much more responsible in your training, and that'll lead to much longer lasting benefits. But our last myth here, to get back on track, is the if you don't use it, you lose it myth. This one's actually true. We mentioned it earlier a few times, but definitely keep in mind that if you stop exercising, it won't take long before you stop receiving some of those benefits that came with the physical activity. All right, there you have it. Hopefully, today was an eye opening experience at looking at prevention and physical activity. There certainly isn't enough time to talk about all the different types of wellness affected by these areas, but if you take one piece of this lecture and you put it into practice today, you might see some immediate benefits, or you might know more about what you need in order to live well. You're certainly welcome to send us any questions that you have about the material, or to spend time going back and re-reviewing the material. Otherwise, best of luck to you on your quiz, and I look forward to seeing everyone next week.